What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be analyzing Mike Licona's arguments for both miracles and the resurrection.
Okay, they honestly believe that he rose from the dead and had appeared to them. We find this in early sources, eyewitness sources, or those rooted in eyewitness testimony. So you've got Paul, and Paul talks about the apostles as well. So Paul claims to be an eyewitness. He knows.
What? No, Paul never claimed to be an eyewitness, and more importantly, he never claimed to have met any eyewitnesses. He only met apostles and general Christians. If you're interested in how wrong Mike Licona is, then please stay tuned. So, last time, we exposed a major flaw in how Mike Licona investigated the resurrection of Jesus. For one thing, he thinks that he's a historian. He's not. He's a New Testament scholar, which is relevant to the question at hand, but that does not make him a historian. He thinks he came to his conclusion as objective as he could by admitting his biases up front. But he is still not objective when he takes a look at the evidence for the resurrection. One primary example of this is that he thinks that we can prove miracles happened in history. And now that's where we are picking up today.
I want to talk about miracles and that sort of thing too. So maybe we can get kind of Hume's kind of objections or something along those lines. You'll probably find some atheists that say the most probable explanation for any event has to be a natural explanation. And the reason why is because all of the documented events we have or something like that, or the vast majority of things we have, we attribute a natural explanation to. So what do you say to somebody that has that kind of objection in mind?
Well, I want them to define again how do they determine something is probable. Okay, how do they assess probability here?
No, not a vast majority of them, all of them. Every miraculous thing that has seemed to have happened in history has always had a natural explanation behind it. There have been no verified suspensions of the natural order of reality. They have to argue against uniformitarianism because otherwise there just simply is no evidence that supports their conclusions. This is the exact same thing that creationists do. Now, he wants to know how we assess this probability. We assess the probability of something happening in a specific way by taking the number of times this specific thing has happened in history and compared it with how many times it's happened in that specific way. Like the likelihood of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. This probability would be fairly high because all you have is a guy crossing a river in a boat or some other kind of natural way. That has happened all throughout history, and so we don't need any kind of spectacular explanation for it. It just is something that happens.
When you say the overwhelming number of events would have natural causes, okay, well, that would rule out any unique event, then would seem to be the least probable explanation, right? Like the universe coming into existence out of nothing. That's a unique event. And so you would have to discredit, you would have to throw out the science, the very strong science that suggests it came into being out of nothing. You just throw it out. Why?
Nope. That was a natural event that happened with natural causes to explain it. We have no reason to think that was a magical event. Our current best explanation comes from quantum scalar fields and how they release an incredibly large amount of energy when they fluctuate from a false vacuum state to a true vacuum state. This is a natural explanation and in fact does not suspend the natural order of reality in order for it to happen. The fact that all events in the past have natural causes behind them would definitely put the probability of a miracle so incredibly low that it becomes negligible. But that incredibly low probability can be overcome by good evidence. This also exposes how the entire case for the resurrection hinges on you suspending your better judgment and allowing unverified claims of the suspension of reality for their case to even make sense. If we allow this suspension of reality, then what's to prevent us from allowing all the other supposed suspensions of reality with equal probability? Ah, yes, it's not their God that did it, therefore it couldn't have happened.
Because you say, well, the majority of events that we see have natural causes, or they are caused to exist by something. So to say the universe was uncaused couldn't have happened that way. but yet that's what the science points to. If you want to talk about why is it the least probable explanation, is it because these things like a resurrection, it doesn't happen by natural causes? Okay, well, if we're talking about an event that happened by natural causes, it wouldn't be a miracle, right?
Sure.
And if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, well, then the resurrection becomes the most probable explanation, right?
No, that is not the most probable explanation. Again, you have failed to prove that God, more specifically your God, even exists. What you have to do is presuppose that your specific version of God exists for your arguments to even make any kind of sense. Nobody says that the universe is uncaused. Well, except for people that don't understand what the scientific theory of the Big Bang actually is. Because the scientific theory doesn't actually say that the Big Bang was uncaused. The only difference between what Mike Licona thinks caused the universe and what the science actually says caused the universe is that he has to invent some kind of cosmic entity in order to start the universe. That kind of ad hoc explanation exposes the leap in logic that religiously minded people have to make. And I do agree with Licona that resurrections, like Jesus, do not happen by natural causes. But until you can prove that not everything happens by natural causes, it will still continue to be the least likely explanation. Again, this is the problem with New Testament studies. They have to resort to ad hoc assertions with no supporting evidence. They just get to claim that they have supporting evidence. You see, Licona would explain to you that we've already proven that his particular version of God exists, even though we don't accept that. And we don't accept it because his evidence doesn't support his conclusion. What you have to do is you have to jump to the conclusion or make that leap in logic in order to make those connections.
So someone might say, well, yeah, but that's assuming God exists and wanted to raise Jesus. Okay, so I think we can give some evidence for that, some good evidence for God's existence, and some evidence that he would have wanted to raise Jesus. But let's just suppose you throw all that out, okay? Then we just say, well, then the probability of the resurrection as a supernatural event would be inscrutable. We wouldn't say it's improbable. You would just say it's inscrutable. Now, if you start off with the a priori assumption that God does not exist, well, then of course you're going to say the resurrection is improbable by supernatural causes because such causes don't exist, right?
You don't have to start off with God does not exist. You could start off with we don't know if a God exists or not. That is a much softer position and much more reasonable given the evidence that we have. Supernatural causes have yet to be proven to actually happen regardless of whether or not a God exists. In fact, the very existence of supernatural causes would mean that we couldn't do science at all. Also, I wouldn't say inscrutable, because that means it's unable to be understood. That kind of assumes that it actually did happen. It's just that now you can't understand it because the supernatural doesn't exist. We are able to explain it without the supernatural existing, so it's definitely not inscrutable, although it's very improbable that it happened. At the end of the section, he admits that his position is improbable unless the supernatural exists. So his entire argument rests on the unproven claim that the supernatural does exist.
So this is where worldview comes in. And a lot of people are going to reject the arguments that God does not exist. So that would be just one way of answering that particular Humean argument.
That's right.
Of course, he puts forth others, and we'd answer those differently.
Yeah, no, I think that you said it well because that kind of assumes that there is so in other words, if it's possible that God exists, then it's possible that miracles happen, right? But if you just assume that it's not possible that God exists, then of course you can't. I mean, you'll have to again come up with a criteria on what you would qualify to be a miracle. And whenever you press people on this, they tend to just kind of, well, I don't know what it would take.
Not all atheists out there would say that it's not possible that God exists. Agnostic atheists would definitely say that it's possible that a God or gods do exist. So it comes off like you're straw-manning the entire argument by stating that all atheists are Gnostic atheists or hard atheists. Those would be atheists that say that God definitely does not exist and it's not possible for him to exist. Also, possible does not mean probable. While it's possible for a deity to exist, it's not probable given the evidence that Jesus was resurrected from the dead by your specific definition of God. Finally, to qualify as a miracle, you would have to show a complete suspension of the natural order of reality. Now, that's a pretty tall order, considering that everything that happens in this reality is subject to the natural order of this reality. So don't act like we can't explain what we would need in order to classify something as a supernatural event. I mean, you just can't substantiate that they actually happen.
Jerry W. says, I think the most reasonable dispute of the resurrection is the stolen body theory. Can you guys help me reason this?
Yep.
Yeah, for the stolen body theory, okay, so there's one of two things here. Either the disciples stole the body or someone else stole the body.
Both of these explanations are natural explanations and are automatically way more likely than a magical Jew resurrection. Now, I don't think that the stolen body hypothesis really pans out. I mean, considering that if there really was an empty tomb and the body really was stolen, the Romans would have definitely went around killing anybody associated with Jesus at the time. We don't have any evidence to suggest that that happened in history, so there's really no reason to think that it did.
One thing that scholars are virtually unanimous on, okay, nearly unanimous at 100%, is that the disciples had experiences shortly after Jesus' death that they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus to them.
Okay. They believed he rose from the dead. Apologists like Licona here love to use this particular point to suggest that just because they believed that he rose from the dead, that actually means that he rose from the dead. That's not exactly what he's doing here, but he may sneak that in somewhere here in a second. Let's see where he's going with this, though.
Okay, they honestly believe that he rose from the dead and had appeared to them. We find this in early sources, eyewitness sources, or those rooted in eyewitness testimony. So you've got Paul, and Paul talks about the apostles as well. So Paul claims to be an eyewitness. He knows the Jerusalem apostles like Peter, James, and John, and he's getting information from them. And he says the apostles are proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus.
What? No, this is all fucked up. First of all, there's no eyewitness testimony to Jesus actually rising from the dead. Paul is our only contemporary witness, and all he says is that he had visions of Jesus, not that he actually saw him. Paul also mentions all the other apostles, and they had visions because of the fact that that's what it meant to be an apostle. Paul never claims to be an eyewitness. He most likely had a hallucination brought on by a schizotypal personality disorder. He never denotes Peter, James, and John as being eyewitnesses of Jesus. He only ever identifies them as apostles, which is very different from disciple. And again, just because they believe something was true does not actually make it true.
We've got numerous ancient sources that report that the disciples were willing to suffer and willing to die for their beliefs. Whether they all died as martyrs, that's up for question. Certainly they were willing to die as martyrs. And we know that several of them did, like Peter, Paul, James, the brother of Jesus. We know that they died as martyrs.
We actually have no good evidence to suggest that Paul or the disciples or the apostles ever died a martyr. Generally, the argument that Peter or Paul died as a martyr rely on Tacitus, Suetonius, and Acts. Acts is definitely historical fiction, as proved by Richard Purbo in The Mystery of Acts. The problem with the other two sources, Tacitus and Suetonius, is that neither of them actually mention Peter or Paul at all. One of the big problems with Tacitus is that the burning of Rome wouldn't have required Paul to recount his faith, even if Tacitus had mentioned him at all. In fact, there are no sources that talk about the martyrdom of Peter and Paul for 200 years. There is a lot of confusion surrounding when and where Paul and Peter died, not even to mention whether or not they were martyred. 1 Clement 5 has Paul dying in Spain while Peter dies in Rome. Some bad comprehension skills in the 2nd century has both Peter and Paul dying in Rome at the exact same time. Then in other sources, they have them both dying in Rome but at different times. This kind of confusion only comes from people that don't know what actually happened. What this comes down to is that we cannot substantiate the claim that the originators of the Christian cult actually died martyrs. You see, the originators of the Christian cult would have preceded Paul, and we don't know how they died. Christian apologists have accepted that Peter and Paul died as martyrs as an apologetic for their faith.
if they're all dying for the gospel proclamation, and then you go out and you're proclaiming the same thing after seeing your colleagues die for doing the same thing you're doing, well, that shows that you're willing to die for it as well. And all this suggests, not that the resurrection's true, but they sincerely believed it was true. So they would not believe that if that's incompatible with them stealing the body. So no one really takes that position. In fact, I don't know of any even skeptical scholars that have taken that within recent years, within several decades now, that there was a stolen body.
Well, we can't establish that they did die for their gospel message. By the time that we can establish that Christians were being martyred and persecuted for their faith, they were far removed from the people that actually originated the religion. So those Christians that were dying for their faith wholeheartedly believed in their faith as being true. But more importantly, they didn't think it was a lie. Just to remind you, I do disagree with the stolen body hypothesis, but it's still vastly more likely to have happened than Jesus resurrecting from the dead. As we established in the previous video, most of the scholars that would disagree with the stolen body hypothesis as a viable option are required by their faith to believe in the resurrection or are contractually obligated by the teaching institution that they work at or go to. Although, Licona is talking about skeptical scholars in this particular section. These skeptical scholars would include people like Bart Ehrman. Even Ehrman thinks that the stolen body hypothesis, however unlikely, is vastly more probable than Jesus resurrecting from the dead.
The other option is that someone else stole the body. But here's the deal there. When we read the gospel accounts, the empty tomb didn't seem to convince anyone, possibly the beloved disciple, okay? But other than that, none of the others were convinced. None of the disciples were convinced that Jesus had been raised from the dead. In fact, Luke reports that when the women came back and said they'd seen angels and that the tomb was empty, they thought the women were telling frivolous tales.
I like how one of their main arguments for the empty tomb is the criterion of embarrassment. This would be the embarrassing fact that the women were the first ones to find the tomb empty. Here, Licona is using the women finding the tomb as a way to downplay the importance of the empty tomb in converting people to the faith. My question is, how can this be an insignificant thing when it's one of the main arguments to convince people that the resurrection happened? Now, Licona has worked extensively with Gary Habermas. Gary Habermas has these things he calls minimal facts, which the empty tomb was part of those minimal facts until he downgraded it. What I'm saying is that they use these arguments when it benefits them, regardless of whether or not it contradicts other arguments that they have. Also, it depends on which gospel you read, and every gospel has something different for the finding of the empty tomb. Actual historians will go with the earliest account that we have. That would be Mark. In Mark, the women find the tomb empty and then run away scared, never telling anybody about it. In the original ending, a 2nd century Christian actually added the longer ending to Mark in order to corroborate the post-resurrection appearances that appear in the other Gospels. This would be an example of a later Christian fixing something they considered embarrassing. The other Gospels have the disciples believing the women or woman immediately. I don't know why you act like Luke is the absolute correct version of these mythical events.
No one believed based on an empty tomb. Certainly Paul would not have believed based on an empty tomb. Paul, the first thing he would have suspected if the tomb were empty would have been theft. They believed based on the appearances. Paul believed because he had an experience he believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him. And the disciples believed because they had experiences they perceived were appearances of the risen Jesus to them. Theft just does not work.
This is interesting because Matthew actually does have an apologetic for why some Jews are saying that the disciples just stole the body. So the stolen body hypothesis has actually been around since people started claiming that Jesus rose from the dead. It's the oldest argument against the resurrection, and it's still way more likely than Jesus actually rising from the dead. Also, if the empty tomb failed to convince the supposed eyewitnesses of the event, then why should it convince people now? Why is this part of Habermas's minimal facts if it's not supposed to be used to convince anyone? The whole empty tomb argument at this point really confuses me. Anytime anybody brings up the empty tomb as proof for Jesus' resurrection, you need to ask them, how do they know that the tomb was found empty? If they say the gospel, then you can tell them that the gospels are not reliable because they aren't eyewitness sources, they don't name their authors, and they only cite scripture as their source. They also happen to be influenced by the writings of Paul. Paul never indicates that the tomb was found empty. So there is literally no evidence in history to support the claim that the tomb that Jesus was supposedly buried in was found empty at any point in time. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you will, please go down below. Let me know what you thought about these sections of What Do You Mean stream. While you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like content like this. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.